What we're about to watch is some old style propaganda. And what I don't mean is like it's literally old, as in it's done in an old style that you would expect to see in the 50s and the 60s from Americans that would go over to the Soviet Union and just film in one of the major capitals after they were guided around by handlers, and they would go like ooh and ah at all the pretty shiny things. But then they would stay away from, say, the countryside or the more dangerous parts of the city, or go into any of the areas that are destitute or that are lacking social services or proper infrastructure. There are many parts of Russia through the winter that were going through terrible power outages. Pipes were bursting and flooding homes, and the flood water would then freeze, literally barring people from going into their front door because their front doors were literally frozen. And these were not only happening in Russia, but also in occupied territory in Mariupol, an area where the Russians are regularly bragging about how they rebuilt everything. There's scandal after scandal because these shell companies that they had given all these contracts to do the rebuilding had taken the money and did either a horrible job or haven't even started the work whatsoever. And in fact, military spending has now exceeded social spending in Russia. There is a lot of money that could have gone towards rebuilding infrastructure and locations across Russia. Like Murmansk is somewhere that always needs some investment. It's somewhere that's, quite frankly, it has a lot of crime. It has terrible infrastructure. A lot of it, and to be blunt, is kind of dirty. And so that's the kind of show that you can't just go to a nation's capital, prance around the business district and the pretty metro and go, ooh la la, what a romantic country. It's why I couldn't, after going to Lviv, be like, wow, this country, this city is so European. Oh my God, it's so pretty. And look, all the alcohol is banned right now. You can't even drink here. At the start of the war, you couldn't drink in Lviv. Lviv's a very relatively conservative city. Oh my gosh, I guess Ukraine is a pretty European city that isn't allowed to drink. Then I'd frolic home and tell everyone no one drinks bathtub vodka in Ukraine. Vodka's banned in Ukraine, and it's so pretty. It looks like Poland, kind. And I wouldn't have had a proper description of the country. Just like Tucker can't, just by showing the Moscow metro. But because there is like strong central authority in Moscow, it's where all the government administrators are, it's where the elites of society are, it's where the business class is, it's of course the center of power in Russia. You know, it's probably one of the places in the country that is the most well kept, has probably some of the best infrastructure. Electricity is a lot less likely to cut out in this area. And so the Moscow metro is purposely kept very pretty, not only for stuff like this, but because, you know, this is where all of the nation's wealth centralizes for the Muscovite. Anyway, he did just like a tour of the Moscow metro. Like, oh, wow, look how pretty it is. There's no filth, no graffiti. This is so unlike America. And look, I'm from DC. Like, I grew up using the DC metro system. Like, there's some graffiti in the DC metro system, but honestly, it's mostly clean. There's like gum, like sometimes it's mostly clean. It's fine from my experience. That doesn't mean it's always perfectly clean, but they have certain rules that you can't take food onto the train and stuff like that. Has helped keep it clean. I mean, it's my point is that you can achieve this in other cities without dictatorship.
One of the ways you understand a society is through its infrastructure, the places.
Also, the Kiev metro is very clean, and it's not an oligarchical dictatorship. I mean, there's definitely problems with oligarchs still in Ukrainian society, but again, just goes to show that to have a clean metro, you don't need to give up your freedoms.
This is where people gather, the places where they go to travel. If you've got a lot of people in one place, it tells you a lot about the people. So with that in mind, we're standing in front of the Kievskaya metro station, and there's a train station next to it. Now, the metro station was built by Joseph Stalin 70 years ago. And the question is, how's it doing now, after 70 years? So we went into it to take a look, and what we found shocked us. Now, that's not an endorsement of...
Dude, he says this every single time he sees anything about Russia. He said, Putin's answer, for the first 44 minutes, his answer about history shocked us. Why would it shock you? If you did any research into Putin, you know he's a big history nerd, and he's this crotchety old man who's just a revanchist history nerd. That's who Putin is. Like, if you watch any of his speeches for the last 10, 15 years, you'd see that. I mean, the speech that opens the war, I would see that. Why is that surprising? He goes into the Moscow metro, and there's not literally people puking and diarrhea-ing everywhere. Like, oh my God, how shocking. Everything in Russia apparently shocks him. Okay, I mean, he could find like a boiled egg in a store and be like, boiled egg, I was told everyone in Russia's starving to death. This is shocking. This is shocking. You could buy 2 eggs in the store. Oh my god, shocking. Everything's shocking. I think shocking to Tucker.
Stalin, who was bad, obviously, nor is it an endorsement of the current president, Vladimir Putin. You may not like him either. But it doesn't change the reality of what...
By the way, this is the mild propaganda we're about to see. This is the mild version, and then we're going to get into the extreme propaganda. This being the mild version is going to become evident in a second.
What we saw...
Well, once we get to the next one.
Or, more precisely, didn't see. There's no graffiti, there's no filth, there are no foul smells, there are no bums or drug addicts or rapists or people waiting to push you onto the train tracks and kill you. No. It's perfectly clean and...
Dude, we need to bring Tucker to Murmansk. We need to have a Tucker Moscow edition Murmansk, okay? That's what we need. Then once he does that deep Murmansk reporting, then I'll respect Tucker as a journalist.
Orderly. And how do you explain that? We're not...
By the way, I'm not trying to take away from the beauty of the Moscow Metro. It is a beautiful metro. It's just trying to use the Moscow Metro as like the standard for Russia. Is pretty, like, if this is the only metro you see or the only infrastructure in Russia you see, which is going to be true for the people watching Tucker's show, they're not getting an honest view of Russia. You cannot go to any nation's major capital or like to its wealthiest areas and then judge it by that. That's how propagandists do it.
Not even going to get.
It's just very shallow. I don't know. Like, couldn't you imagine if I just went to Lviv, then went home, and then released the documentary in Ukraine? It was like, okay, guys. I mean, I didn't visit any of the frontline areas. I didn't visit any of the other countryside. Like, I still need to go to Odessa. There are still regions of the country I feel like I need to go to before I feel like I've truly like seen all of Ukraine. I still haven't gone to the mountains. I really want to go to the Carpathian Mountains. It hasn't been very related to the war, so I haven't had a reason, but I want to do that this time around. I want to go to Odessa. You know, I don't think the Odessa like opera or the opera house is really my vibe, but I should maybe at least entertain it if I want to get a more thorough viewing of the country. I wish Tucker could have spent a month over there. He could have taken the time to explore more than Moscow.
Yes.
Maybe my standards are too high.
That's not our job. We're only going to ask the question. And if your response is to shout at us slogans dumber than the slogans we used to call Soviet and mock, that's not really an answer. How does Russia, a country we're told is a gas station with nuclear weapons, have a subway station that normal people use to get to?
By the way, as a percentage of GDP, that is the case. But to me, like, you can call that degrading if you want. And I understand how it can be taken as degrading because then you're, all this literature, all these songs, all this other stuff. I understand that. But when we talk about Ukraine, we call it the breadbasket of Europe. And that's because 70% of its GDP comes from grain and agriculture. It comes from sunflower and sunflower oil and products like that. Now, does that reduce it from like Taras Shevchenko and the poets and the Black Anarchist movement, all the beautiful stuff from Ukrainian history, Green Ukraine? If anybody wants to find that niche history out, you can Google it yourself. No, but, you know, as a percentage of GDP, oil and gas makes up a gigantic part of the Russian economy.
To work and home every single day that's nicer than anything in our country.
Nicer than anything in our country. The Moscow Metro is nicer than anything in our country. Wow. Patriot. Tucker Carlson.
We're not going to speculate. We're just going to raise the question and wait for someone in charge to give us an answer. What is the answer? So we'll stop the lecture and let you take a look for yourself at what the Kievskaya metro station in Moscow, Russia looks like today, February 2024, in the middle of a war. Here it is.
Okay, I don't need to listen to their pretty music, okay? But it's like just straight up just pretty, like, oh my god, look how glorious these Soviet workers are! Glorious Soviet workers! So glory in the labor, glorious labor. Look at all these people. All of them not shoving, none of them listening to the rap music, not a single criminals around, this order in society. Oh, it's beautiful. Oh, it's just so beautiful. Why hasn't the West have this? Oh my God, it's so, look at these poles with, look at these guys walking. Like, all of this is in the Kiev metro as well, by the way. Like, a lot, like, you got similar, like, beautiful murals. Like, the Kiev station metro, the first time I saw Lenin still there. So, oh, beautiful Lenin. Oh, yes, Tucker Carlson, conservative Fox News host, Lenin, woohoo. I can show you guys, like, the Kiev metro. The Kiev metro is very pretty. I remember the intro to the entrance to the Kiev metro was actually gorgeous. I remember the first time I saw it, I was literally blown away actually by it. It was very pretty, very beautiful. This is achievable by us. This is easily achievable by us. Like, he like hyped it up so much, it actually was kind of a letdown. It was some murals, I think. Like, it was pretty, it was nice, but you can find that in Ukraine. You can even find, like, probably equally beautiful murals in the United States, almost certainly. You can find it in many other European countries as well. I feel like he overhyped it. I wish if he just led with the metro system and none of the, like, half of it being made up by him just like stunting on our evil metros, I think it actually would have been more effective. Next one. Now, that was the mild one. Here is the heavy propaganda, because this right here is just deceitful. This is just deceitful. And honestly, this is the type of stuff that should discredit someone as a journalist. Check this out.
I went from...
This is what I remember, like, gray zone reporters did in Venezuela to try to prove that it wasn't that expensive.
I went from amused to legitimately angry. So we were guessing what this would cost. Everybody.
So to be clear, he's in a grocery store in Russia buying groceries to try to compare the prices with the United States.
He hears from the United States, buys groceries, and we didn't pay any attention to costs as we were just putting in the cart what we would actually eat over a week. And we all came in around $400, about $400. It was $104 US here. And that's when you start to realize that ideology maybe doesn't matter as much as you thought. Corruption. If you take people's standard of living and you tank it through filth and crime and inflation, and they literally can't buy the groceries they want, at that point, maybe it matters less what you say or whether you're a good person or a bad person. You're wrecking people's lives in their country, and that's what our leaders have done to us. And coming to a Russian grocery store, the heart of evil, and seeing what things cost and how people live, it will radicalize you against our leaders. That's how I feel anyway, radicalized. We're not making any of this up, by the way.
I think this actually, well, number one, he makes everything up and then just says that at the end. He said he didn't make it up, so it wasn't made up. Okay. So a few things. This is like stupid propaganda. In Russia, they do not make the same amount of money as you and me as an American, for the Americans watching. For a lot of Europeans, this is also true. So California has a larger GDP than Russia, right? And that's not, I'm not trying to stunt on all the Russians, but the average wages in Russia are much lower than the average wages in the United States. The cost of living in Russia is much lower than what it is in the United States, but that's also because they're paid much less. Same way that if somebody's in West Virginia, they're paid much less than other places in the country, but that's also because in West Virginia, the cost of living is much less. So what he just did in front of all of you would be the equivalent of me going to West Virginia, paying much less for groceries than it is in my home state here of Maryland, and then turning to you and saying, Maryland politics, Maryland bureaucrats. People talk about all the decay of the infrastructure or the unemployment, all the coal minings, all the drugs, all the corruption here, the terrible Republican administration here, but the products here are so much cheaper. Wow, I guess all of that ideology and government stuff and corruption stuff, all that's nonsense. And by the way, I love the idea of him hand-waving corruption after making such a big fuss over Hunter Biden, as if Russian corruption doesn't matter that much, but we all need to pay attention to the deep, deep corrupt tail of Hunter Biden's penis. Okay, so a Russian makes about 1/5 to 1/7 I gotta remember the exact numbers. I was over generous in my response to this on Twitter. I said 1/5. Some other economists corrected me and said it's actually closer to 1/6 to 1/7 of what an American makes. And so, if it is true, the numbers he's saying, which is that what would have been a $400 deal in the United States is a $100 deal there, and they're making what, about 1/5 to 1/6 what an average American is making. Well, you can see how the math isn't adding up there. Might also say that Russians on average spend much more than Americans on food every week. Some people were throwing out numbers as high as 30%. And when I heard that number, I did a double take and I checked it, and then I double checked it, and then I checked other local sources in Russia. And then when the local sources in Russia also said 30%, I was like, wow, that is insane that even the Russian sources are saying 30%. But to be clear, for the people who are throwing around that number, the 30% has to do with the lowest percentile of the moneymakers in Russian society. The higher percentiles in Russian society, I think it's actually closer to about 8 to 10%. So it changes depending on what income bracket you are. But there are Russians in Russia spending like 30% and more on groceries. Russians on average are spending more than Americans on groceries. They spend a lot on groceries. In fact, we've seen the price of an egg go up in Russia by over 61% last year. That means at the start of the year, if you had like an egg worth, I don't know, $1, of course, $1 egg is crazy, but $1 egg, it'd be $1.61 by the end of the year. And that issue became so bad that they started having like let them eat cake moments on Russian state TV, because the issue would come up and they would say, oh, well, then my advice as a nutritionist and an economist is go eat meat instead. That's not an answer, not to mention that would also just put strain on that industry. It's not an answer to the question. And the grocery stores responded by limiting the amount of eggs people could buy. Do you guys remember during COVID when they were saying you can only get like one? And this is only true in some areas, and it was quickly corrected by the market. But in some areas, you could only get so much toilet paper, so much stuff, because people were going out and hoarding. Well, in Russia right now, and I think this issue might be starting to wear off a little bit, they tried to import a bunch of new eggs, but a lot of the eggs they imported ended up being bad and they had to throw a lot of them out. But they could only buy like 1 or 2 eggs at certain stores. And so this is, again, my point of, if you just stay in Moscow and you just go to the places that the Russian handlers direct you towards, if you just stay in this city where all the center of power is, you're not going to get the best view of the country. And if you're coming from it from an American-centric perspective as well, thinking about an American consumer in this Russian market and not a Russian consumer in the Russian market, then you're going to come to this type of propaganda, which is what this ultimately ends up being, because it sells a picture to Americans that's not true. If you were in Russia making Russian wages, that type of bill that Tucker is talking about would be devastating for the average Russian working class person. It's because they're getting paid less. But this information wasn't included by Tucker. And so if somebody's ignorant and doesn't understand much about, Russian economics, and I would imagine that most of the people watching Tucker Carlson programming probably doesn't know much about Russian domestic economics. I mean, if you're spending your 9 to 5, working your hard job at the oil rig or whatever, and then you come home, you probably don't spend most of your time studying complex foreign trade agreements, much less the domestic economic conditions of a foreign country. And so it's a prime audience, considering they don't know much about Russia, for him to trick in this way, with this deceitful interpretation of what a Russian market is like. He's not providing vital context. And it all is packaged into a pretty gross message, because he starts like hand waving stuff. After he makes this big pitch misrepresenting the Russian economy, see what he turns it into.
Ideology maybe doesn't matter as much as you thought.
Ideology doesn't matter as much as you thought. Democracy, the freedoms we enjoy, stuff like that, the ideology that leads to shaping the societies we have, that doesn't nearly matter as much as you think. So the types of things where we have a cop walk up to us and allows us to record the cop, the things that, we value, the ideological foundation that allows us, to do these things, the rights of man, instead of the Ivan Ilinin type not fascist nonsense that Putin believes in, like that doesn't matter as much. That's a pretty scary message to take away from a food market. Corruption doesn't matter as much. And he put like parentheses on the corruption. Corruption's still an issue in the United States. We can see that from Senator Menendez and the Egyptian gold bars. But corruption in Russia makes corruption in the United States look almost laughable. And that's not to necessarily, again, say that corruption in the United States isn't serious. Corruption manifests in different economies and different societies in different ways. Once you deal with one type of corruption, people don't necessarily jump out completely of corruption. They just move to a different type, or they try to bring that corruption within the legal bounds of society, try to legalize certain types of corruption, right? But for him to just hand wave corruption, even though corruption was a major motivator as to why the Russians performed so badly in the war, corruption killed a lot of Russians in this war. When they're trying to like use those old tourniquets that snap out in the field and kill them. Maybe if they spent proper money on getting replaced tourniquets, that wouldn't have happened. All those tires that had rotted out, so when they drove them out into the field, they popped, and then the Ukrainians killed the soldiers in them that were stranded. Maybe those soldiers would still be alive if it wasn't for the corruption. The stealing of fuel, the stealing of other things. I mean, not to mention all the companies that did government military contracts that were just Putin's friends who didn't do a good job, and then the soldiers ended up getting piss poor products. This isn't only a problem in Ukraine, of course. There was the military jacket scandal in Ukraine. I mean, this isn't only a problem in Russia. There's also a problem with the military jacket scandal of Ukraine. But these are serious issues for Russians. You ask Russians what they think of corruption, you'll get them angry. It's one of the, well, Russians are generally right now pretty apolitical, to be blunt about it. The issue of corruption, if you ask them about it, that is something that does tend to get under their skin more than other issues, for Ukrainians especially. And so to hand wave that issue, even though it was a major motivator for Euromaidan, even though it's a major motivator for why all of this war is happening in the first place, even though it's something that the Ukrainians are trying to tackle hard, and if the Ukrainians tackle effectively, will become an advantage they have over the Russians, it's like just a hand waveable thing. Even though, like, if Joe Biden like stole like $5 billion from government coffers, this man would be all over it as the biggest scandal in the century. But you go look at Putin's fucking gigantic palace that Alexei Navalny did a documentary on. As much as I don't like a lot of Navalny's politics, that documentary documenting that corruption is real and it's good. Like, does none of that matter? When so many Russians lived in destitute poverty, but to him it wouldn't, because he didn't bother go visiting Murmansk. I mean, the ways that I've seen poverty affect this war in Ukraine, a lot of the people who are near the front unable to evacuate are the most impoverished, because all they have is their home, all their belongings are their home. They've got no other family to take care of them, so they feel like they don't got an option to leave. A lot of the people who are stuck in occupied territory are people who can't afford $5,000 to pay some version of, like, I don't know, a Ukrainian coyote to smuggle them out of there, get them across the river, or pay for the documents so they can go around the long way, let alone abandon their home. Like, there's ways the poverty is. I saw how a lot of the older homes that are like 80, 90 years old, some of them are made like of this weird, like almost mud plaster that when hit by these bombs, I mean, if there's no safe room in there, you're done. It can, like, one of these glide bombs the Russians drop can just kill tons of people if they're using these old village homes. So some of these most destitute communities that are concentrated in eastern Ukraine, in the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine that Russia said they were coming to Ukraine to liberate. These are the areas with some of the weakest infrastructure that lead to higher civilian casualties because these homes can't protect them from bombs. These are ways that I have seen poverty manifest in Ukraine. I've seen homeless people with gashes in their skull walking down the road with just one bandage wrapped around, because who's going to treat them? They don't got the health care. He won't even bother. He's too drunk to even feel it anyway. It's horribly tragic how that poverty is manifested during the war. But I had to explore Ukraine to see that. I had to go to Kherson to see that homeless man and take those pictures I've never published. I didn't feel comfortable publishing them. Tucker just went to Moscow and did this. And that's why it's ended up like propaganda. He doesn't have that more total picture. If I just went to Lviv, wandered around, it'd be like, oh, Ukraine seems like a generally peaceful place. Oh, ha, ha, ha. And that would be it. I'd have a very shallow, surface level understanding of the war and of Ukraine. So This isn't journalism. This is, I mean, it just ends up being propaganda, whether he intended it to or not.